California State Controller Betty Yee was first elected into office in 2014 and then reelected in 2018. She has a long career in public service and is experienced through her endeavors in state and local government, her positions on multiple boards and commissions, and the multiple projects and initiatives she has started and is currently involved in. Controller Yee, it is an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you.
I'm sure our audience wants to hear your answers to all of our questions, so I'm going to jump straight into it with a very broad first question. How did you get involved in public service and politics?
It is, I think, a story that is not unique to me, but I certainly had some unique circumstances that faced my family and myself. My first foray into public service really was to be an advocate. I was an advocate for my immigrant Chinese parents who owned a laundry and dry cleaning business in San Francisco, and really had to be their advocate when interfacing with government agencies. And I actually took care of the books for the family business. And, and I realized that, being an advocate meant, just really being their voice. They were not fluent in English. And when I was 13 years old, I was their voice, in addition to the other 3 Chinese American families in the neighborhood in San Francisco. And to be a voice to oppose the school busing program that the San Francisco Unified School District would be pursuing that would affect my little sister. And I remember going and speaking on behalf of these 4 Chinese American families who designated me to speak at a local town hall meeting at the local elementary school, just 2 blocks away from my family business. And the statement I made at the age of 13, the parents had drafted pretty much went to say that they were not opposed to the goals of the busing program, but really wanted to have the school district realize that it would pose a hardship for parents who were in small business, who could not close up their business should an emergency arise with any of their children. None of the families had a car or drove, and it would take them well over 2 hours on public transportation to bring their child home should emergency arise. I made that statement, and I also remember they particularly wanted me to state that they wanted the funding for the school busing program to be used to improve the quality of the schools throughout the city. I made that statement. I went back to my seat in the school auditorium, and the school busing program then took place over the better part of the next 30 plus years. And everything was fine. Nothing happened to my little sister. But that impression, that one experience left an impression in me really for the rest of my life, that I was a voice for someone. And when I think about public service and politics, it is exactly that. How do we serve the greater public good? How do we be sure that any challenges that we face as a community, as a society, are informed by the voices of those who are closest to the problems? And that in the world of politics, which I still view as something very positive and not what you read about in the newspaper and all the contentiousness and the some of the negative aspects of politics, is really about people. It's about being sure that people have a voice, that people have input into the decisions that are going to be affecting their lives. So then I decided I would take my experience and background in finance, hone running the family business finances. That became really, I was always good at numbers, and throughout my education, and certainly in my public service life, I've always dealt with fiscal and financial issues. It's a space that I'm comfortable in, mainly because money drives everything. We know that in our professional lives, in our personal lives, and certainly in public policy, that is the case. So I just became very, very interested in how to marry my love for advocacy and being sure that people's voices were included in decision-making along with the decisions around the allocation of resources.
I love that. And thanks for sharing how you got involved into public service. And I'm sure that our audience is, very thankful to hear that story. My next question for you, how do you run for public office, being that you've been the state controller for several years here? How did you go about that?
Sure. So prior to being elected controller, I actually served on the California Board of Equalization, which is the nation's only elected tax commission. I represented a district along the California coast from the Oregon border down to Santa Barbara. There were 4 seats that are elected by district, and then the 5th member is the state controller. So I still serve on that board today. It is, running for office was not something I dreamed about doing. Definitely was not a teenage dream of mine. And it was a way to continue doing the work that I love, which is in the whole fiscal financial arena, and also kept me in the tax policy arena, which I just find fascinating. How to run for office is something that I think is, you will speak to political consultants and they will have very different approaches for how to run and how to win. For me, it was really about doing the work and really having my background, really hopefully be considered meritorious and hopefully deserving of being elected to public office. When I ran, my experience really was at that point, 25 plus years of experience where I had worked for other elected officials. And so I really kind of had a good sense of the inside, behind the scenes, inner workings of government, and just felt that I was really qualified to run. So I think and why I say it's personal is that we each have to know when we're ready to run. And I can tell you when I was younger, I don't think I ever would have thought that I was ready, but having, served so many elected officials, worked on so many policy issues, I did feel very equipped to run. And then a lot of it really has to do with, how do you run a campaign? And I think for anyone who's interested in running for office, the first thing to do is to work on a campaign. Really get an inside look at, what's demanded of a campaign, what's demanded of, what's demanded of a candidate, the time commitment, and just being, really eyes wide open about, what it's going to take to run for office. And then not only that, but really understanding the job that you're running for, the position that you're running for. I do see a lot of people who have ambitions to run for office, but once they're elected are a little lost about how to, pursue serving in office. And I would say, that's probably not a good thing. That exudes confidence with the voters. So really knowing that knowing why you want to run, knowing the position that you're running for well, and also knowing what you intentionally want to do while you're serving. And some of that will unfold while you're in office, but I think what motivates all of us to run is that we always want to we want to serve. We want to just always see if we can provide for the common good. And I think that's an intention that is shared regardless of your party affiliation. But things do become partisan once you're in office, and so. And what I'm happy to say today is that for anyone who's interested in running, unlike when I first was interested in running, or even when I was helping on other people's campaigns, there are many, many training programs that prepare candidates to run for office at all levels of government. So I'm happy to see those. I do think that they are good programs that really prepare any candidate for what's to come. And I think the last thing I do want to say about this is that being a candidate, you have a lot of demands on you. You will have people try to mold you into a person that you probably aren't. You're going to have people who are going to want to know what your positions are on a whole myriad of issues. And I would say that the biggest takeaway for me, having run for statewide office, run for a state level office like the tax board, is you just stay true to yourself. I think it's just one of the things that I've learned a lot about myself in this process. And I think that's just one of the things that often times gets lost as we pursue these public offices.
Thank you, Controller Yee. And just a follow-up question to what you mentioned, what do you believe is the most challenging part of running for public office, and what has been the most fulfilling part of it for you?
Sure, absolutely. The most challenging part is really just, and I did not come up through the ranks of local government. So the first office I ran for was for the tax board. I represented 9 million Californians. So how to get my message out to 9 million Californians? I love people. I wish I could have knocked on the doors of every 9 million of those Californians and had a conversation, but that would not be the most efficient way to run a campaign. So I think the hardest part is just, knowing that you have a limited amount of time to really get your message out, to hopefully be able to persuade voters that you're the best candidate. The other frustrating part, I have to say, is being a woman. we are not, I think, still taken seriously. I know that I had an opponent who specifically ran against me because he thought that he could beat a woman. And so I think that being a woman is still a disadvantage. I actually consider it an asset, but in the political world, I think it's still considered a disadvantage. For women who want to run, and I know many women who do, who have young children, they have to make those decisions about whether that's the right time for them, how to provide for childcare when you're on the campaign trail. I mean, just things like that are real practical kinds of considerations that women have to really be more mindful of than men running. And then obviously raising money. The fundraising, it is a proven fact that women who run tend to have more difficulty raising money, as I said, because we're not taken seriously. I know what my own experience when I've done call time for money, when I've had in-person meetings with prospective donors. It's taken 3, 4, or 5 times going back to those same people before they were convinced that this was something that they wanted to invest in. So I think those are some of the difficulties in running. The highlight about running, and I do have to say this, is what else would thrust you into a position of meeting people that you otherwise may not meet? And I have met some amazing people. We live in a great state. It is a beautifully diverse state. It is of diverse perspectives. Our people and backgrounds are diverse. And to be able to go to every region of the state, and I did go to every 58 county, all of the 58 counties in the state when I ran for controller in 2014. And I cannot say, and I wish there were a way that I could have chronicled that experience, but just the shared commonalities that we have across the different regions of California, all the way to the differences among us that I think really need to be showcased more. That, for you, you're at UC Riverside, to know that the challenges in the Inland Empire share some commonality with challenges that maybe somebody in the where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area or in the Central Valley may experience. But yet we know that there are really strong attributes in each of our regions to where I'm convinced today that this is the case, and government has to do a better job of making the connection, that any challenge being faced anywhere in California can be solved in California. And we just have to, match up the talent, match up the ambition, match up just, where we've got, strengths and attributes in other parts of the state that can actually be deployed to help with challenges being met in some of our more remote areas.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, I really thought that what you mentioned about running as a female was very noteworthy, that it adds a lot of challenges to running a campaign. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo what Joanna said. I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think it's something that moving forward, some people may start forgetting or may not consider as a factor when it comes to running for office. And it can affect other parts of, and it does affect other parts of our lives. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah.
So we've spoken a lot about running for office and what you were interested in, but I'd also like to talk about the position you're currently in and what you do. So I understand you serve as the chair of the Franchise Tax Board, which is directly involved in collecting California's taxes. So can you briefly explain how this agency functions and what elements you're specifically responsible for?
Sure. No, absolutely. And maybe, Kevin, if I could, let me maybe back up a little bit, just talk about my, just what a controller does. It does vary from state to state. In some states, controllers are not elected, they're appointed, but by and large, they are elected. Here in California, I do serve as the independent fiscal watchdog over our state's finances. So from that perspective, any payment, so as controller, I pay the bills for California. So I'm responsible for all the disbursements to pay our bills. I do handle payroll for over 280,000 state employees and employees in the California State University system. We are responsible for all of the financial reporting for California. So I do, our office issues the annual comprehensive financial report for the state of California, just to talk about the state's fiscal condition and certainly looking at how we I'm the independent auditor for the state of California. Every payment that leaves the state is audited before it does get paid. So, so we are pretty much a watchdog. And if I could make just a little bit of a plug, it's in most states, it's either the controller or the treasurer that has the responsibility of administering the unclaimed property program. This is a program where companies have to turn over properties that they've been holding on to and for which they've not been able to find and locate the rightful owners. So it could be an abandoned savings account. Maybe you've moved and you forgot you had a savings account. Could be a uncashed refund check. Could be a utility deposit. That I'm just going to ask those who are listening to this podcast, if you believe that you have property that you may have lost, or maybe you don't, just do a search under claimit.ca.gov. That's CLAIMIT.ca.gov. This is the public database that my office maintains of all the properties that are turned over to my office from various companies, banks, insurance companies, and the like. And search under your name, all the different names that you've had during your lifetime. Search for your friends, search for your family members, and see if we're holding any property for you. We would like to return it. I do have policy responsibilities as well. So as you mentioned, Kevin, I do serve on a number of different boards and commissions, the Franchise Tax Board being one of them. So as chair of the Franchise Tax Board, obviously this is the tax board that administers the income tax, both personal and corporate income tax. And much of my responsibilities as chair of the board is a 3-member board that also includes the governor's director of finance, as well as the chair of the State Board of Equalization. We are essentially a rulemaking board, but we also hear on occasion appeals as well, tax appeals. And that this particular board and agency is essentially really focused on how do we make the taxpayer experience one that is easy, to make tax compliance just something that is not going to pose a hardship for any Californian. We have had a lot of programs that have been new, that have been added to the Franchise Tax Board's set of responsibilities. Most recently, the Golden State stimulus payments that the governor and the legislature has enacted for low-income working families. So to be able to identify who that money should go to be sure that we have systems in place to have that happen. My office does issue the checks, but in terms of identifying who receives them, that is the work of the Franchise Tax Board staff. So we're essentially overseeing the operations, not the day-to-day operations, but certainly the strategic direction about tax administration in the whole income tax area, as well as hearing appeals. And part of why I like to say, and part of why I like to say that we like to always improve on the taxpayer experience is that we actually have a pretty good rate of tax compliance. So it's voluntary compliance. And when you think about Californians and their interaction with the state of California, there probably are 2, maybe 3 places where they directly interact with the state of California. That would be the DMV, the Franchise Tax Board, and probably most recently the Employment Development Department. So we definitely want to make this the best experience that they can have.
Yeah, and it sounds like you've got your hands in a lot of different things there, a lot of moving parts. If I can jump to another question here, we understand that you're involved in multiple issues and causes, including climate change, economic development, and affordable housing, among others.
Yeah.
How can Californians get involved with other issues that affect us?
Yeah, this is, Californians can always be involved with issues that affect us. And I will say, at the state level, because we are the 5th largest economy in the world, I think a lot of the mindset for those of us serving in state service is we think globally, but act locally. And locally is the big state of California. But also acting locally means that for many Californians, I always say, pay attention to what your local governments are doing. They are the closest to what you are experiencing in your daily lives, and their decisions are going to probably matter the most in your daily lives. So following the public meetings of your elected city councils, your boards of supervisors, your water district, your school districts, really taking the opportunity of the public comments, sections of their agendas to be sure that you are providing input on the various issues on the agenda, or maybe even items not on the agenda, they will take public comment. And then more importantly, I will say that anything that is happening at the state level. You have legislators that represent districts who are always willing to hear from their constituents. And a lot of them do have outreach events in their communities. And so trying to make that connection, if you want to express an opinion, to also reach out to your local elected legislators. For me, I get a lot of constituent mail. We have a very, very robust constituent operation where we do respond on a whole host of issues affecting the state. I will say I'm very proud of my office because we are probably one of the few state offices where we have people actually answering the phones when the public calls. And so we tend to get a lot of calls intended for other state agencies and departments, but we're happy to be a navigator in that regard. I think for me, I got involved, as I said, in my early life as a child, helping my parents' laundry and dry cleaning business. And it was really that interface with government agencies that really had me thinking a lot about, just what does that experience look like for an immigrant family, right? Trying to be successful with a small business. If I were older at that time, I probably would have had more input about how they could have made it easier. For example, maybe some in-language resources, but at the time, we were still considered a minority in that part of San Francisco where I grew up. So there are always opportunities to weigh in, but using our local elected officials, our public meetings as really the tools to provide input.
Thank you for that. And it's really great to hear, especially from someone in a really important position in the state, that there are ways for Californians and really anyone to actually be involved and help, no matter how big or little it is, and any issues that affect them or affect their communities in general. And it's just really great to hear that these avenues exist for them.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to transition a little bit into another topic. So I understand that you co-founded the Asian Pacific Youth Leadership Project, which is basically involved in exposing high school students to public policy and service. So what was one of the core reasons you started this initiative?
Thank you for the question, Kevin. The project now is I think just over 35 years old. So it was founded a while ago when I was working as staff in the California State Legislature. And I got involved with co-founding the project with a number of my staff colleagues because we did not see elected members of the legislature who were from the Asian Pacific Islander community. And we felt that what really needed to happen was early exposure to the whole political, public service, public policy arena for our youth, so that we were kind of planting a seed, if you will. So the project is essentially a 3-day conference that brings 50 high school students from throughout California to participate in mock legislative sessions, in really understanding, kind of the cultural identity as a benefit and as a barrier to service, to public service, to really understanding that public service comes in all shapes, forms, and sizes. So for my youth in the API community, that didn't matter if you were driven to pursue a pre-med degree, or if you were driven to go to law school, if you were driven into engineering, that there's always room for public service. In fact, we welcome a lot of backgrounds and different expertise in public service. And so this was really a great way to just plant that seed. And I'm happy to say that over the course of the 30 years, we've had some alumni from the project run for local office. We have some that are serving in high-level administrative positions. And I think when you just watch and witness young people, and this is something that I think is really something that we need to do better, and that is we need to incorporate the voices of young people more in our public policy arena. And one, for them to actually understand how public policy is made. It is a process. And it's a process that I actually respect a lot, and particularly if we can have it be more inclusive. And secondly, I do think that when we do involve young people, they can see themselves actually being the decision makers at some point. And so not have it be so mysterious about what it is to be a legislator, what it is to be, a state controller. So that was really the gist of the project and the impetus for the project. And I'm happy to say that today we actually have a robust API legislative caucus. So we do have members elected and from both sides of the aisle, who both Democrat and Republican, who are serving our constituents in all parts of California.
That's really great to hear. And as a brief follow-up, in a kind of more general sense, what more can we do, like both as a state and as a nation, and I guess as individuals as well, to ensure that our public servants are diverse and accurately represent their constituents, like you were mentioning? Is there anything else that we could do?
Absolutely. So here's, and I think we have to be very intentional about it. So, one of the things that really has struck me with this COVID pandemic is obviously the disproportionate numbers of cases in our communities of color, particularly the Latinx community. And certainly the way that information was being disseminated in our ethnic communities. And I just think, government needs to do better. And part of doing better is knowing that we have that kind of representation, from those communities who are, like I said, in decision-making roles and roles that actually have responsibilities for disseminating information and so on. For me, it's more than just about, having that representation. It is also more about understanding what works in these communities. So for example, I've been, my first foray into government and particularly why I decided to stay in public service. I started out in public service pretty quickly out of graduate school. I served on a county public health commission right when the HIV/AIDS crisis was breaking. And I was tasked by my colleagues on the commission to go to Sacramento and bring home some additional public health dollars so that we can deal with this crisis. We need to provide outreach and education. There wasn't any, even any signs of promises for treatment yet in those early days. And so it was just really it was a crisis. I went to Sacramento on a fellowship. And this is something that I do want to put in a plug for. We do have the Capital Fellows Program that is administered under the auspices of the Center for California Studies at California State University, Sacramento. And for those who are fellows, you can earn master's degree credits during your fellowship. It's a 10-month program, and both the California State Senate, the California State Assembly, as well as the executive branch of California look for fellows every year to serve in different capacities. I started out as a fellow. I did apply for a fellowship at the urging of my colleagues at the county, and got into the fellowship program. And I served, was placed with the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services, where I learned the state budget process, where I worked on a number of issues that today I look back on and think, well, that was obvious. And I'll talk about some of the first bills that I worked on in a moment. But what was telling about my time in Sacramento was that I quickly observed and learned that there were not a lot of women or people of color advising our legislators around fiscal policy. And I thought, this has to change. And so after my 10-month fellowship, I decided to stay and try to change that. And I'm glad to say today that there is much more diversity among the legislative staff, and certainly among legislative staff leaders who are key policy advisors. And I think that has a lot to do with how we're able to hopefully be better at serving our diverse communities in California, and but also understanding how these communities work. And so I just want to go back to this point. I think government has to be a little bit more nimble about what does work. We know that, for example, what works in the API community, the Latinx community, is a lot of people get their information in those communities from very informal sources. You're not going to get it through traditional, maybe health clinic or health organization, and maybe it's the news, maybe it's through news on the radio, but mostly it's going to be through trusted sources. So whether it's through a church, whether it's through in the Latinx community, I know we see a lot of people who serve as informal sources of information, the promotores who are in these communities, who are just trusted sources of information. And I think as a government, we have to recognize that we know that if we want to really touch these communities, if we want to be sure that they can access services, we're going to have to go to where they're at, which means that we lift up, these promotores. We lift up, communications through, radio and other media that people rely on. So I think this is really a big lesson that I've learned coming out of the COVID pandemic, is kind of what I've known in my gut, just being from the API community, but certainly substantiated during the COVID crisis.
Thank you for that, Ms. Yee. I wanted to just ask one more question as we start to close out here. You are the state controller for one of the world's largest economies. What goals do you have both in your current position and beyond?
Absolutely. I've been I'm a first generation Californian and first generation American. California has been a state that's been very kind to me. By all accounts, I should not even be in this position. I grew up poor to immigrant parents, like 6 kids in our family. And I remember even, helping my parents in their laundry and dry cleaning business, negotiate with vendors. And if I didn't get a good price on like a gross of buttons or a dozen zippers, for the business, we probably wouldn't be able to afford that carton of milk on the table, that week. And so, I'm very mindful of that and how, that's still an experience for many, immigrant families in our state. My goals really are this, and it's really simple. I think when you look at how diverse California is, it is not a surprise that we need to be sure that all of our policies are centered around racial and economic justice and equity. And I think, the goals that I have for the remainder of my term as controller is to look at post-pandemic, how do we help build that equity in disproportionately affected communities? Everything from climate impacts to economic impacts, and using tools that government has, but also how do we partner with others to be sure that we are helping communities build resilience? Because the pandemic that we're experiencing is not going to be the last one that we're going to experience. And when you look at public health as really kind of the foundation of all healthcare, we're going to have public health crises when it comes to climate change, whether it's going to be from our unsafe drinking water, maybe inadequate food supply, chronic health conditions exacerbated. And all of that, I think, will continue to be issues that we're going to have to contend with. So really, how do we help communities build resilience? And I think the way to do that, one, is to be sure those voices are at the table for decision making. So I'm very much about going into those communities, identifying where the leadership is, being sure that their voices are being invited into our public policy arena, as well as our democratic arena. And then secondly, to look at from a direction of fiscal resources perspective, that we are not leaving these communities behind. And I'm very happy with the fact that during the pandemic, we actually are doing well fiscally. And so there have been a lot of investments made in these various communities. I also just want to lift up our Indigenous communities as well, because they have always borne the brunt disproportionately of all of these impacts. And so to now be able to include them as hopefully some of the beneficiaries of what we're going to do to combat climate change, to look at protecting our environment, to look at how we're going to overcome this COVID pandemic and prepare ourselves for more. So I have a concept that I like to call future proofing. It's usually kind of an engineering term that is about how do we have our structures all strengthened for future shocks, expected and unexpected. And I feel that way about future proofing our communities and people. And I think we have a lot of work to do in that arena. It's what I'm committed to do for the remainder of my term as controller. And also, beyond that, at this point, I am looking at just, how do we be sure that all these communities are touched? And so that's my commitment in terms of, just what makes a great democracy, but also what will continue to build strength in our California.
As a daughter of immigrants myself, thank you, Controller, for sharing your story. In addition to that, I'm sure our listeners will get a lot out of what you've shared today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I was actually going to say the same thing as Joanna. As a first generation college student and as the son of immigrants, it is really great to hear that this is something that is being prioritized and being talked about and actually being mentioned so that it can, like you said, potentially be solved in the future through policy. And I think kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think the solution is kind of within the problem itself, where, if we actually get more diversity in our in public office, in the people who actually represent us, then they can do a better job of actually helping us whether on a multitude of issues, policy-related issues. So for our last question, I just want to ask very broadly, you're an expert in public service. You've been doing this for a really long time. So is there any specific advice you would give to students that are potentially listening that are interested in running for public office in the future?
Yes, do it. But do it in an informed way. Do it in a way where you are seeking out mentors. There are lots who are, myself included, colleagues in elected office who would be more than willing to serve as mentors. Work on a campaign. I mean, first and foremost, get a sense of what it's about. You can start with just working on a local campaign. You can start, maybe even working on a state level campaign or congressional campaign, but just get that first eye look at what the demands are of a campaign and of a candidate. And then I would say really do some work introspectively, with yourself. And this was really important because, as I said, and I'll just leave with this last bit, and it will be a homework assignment. So I apologize. I know you get enough homework. So when I first decided to run for office, which, as I said, was not something I dreamed of doing, I had a kitchen cabinet of just colleagues and friends with whom I worked for decades with, and just had their trust, and the trust was shared, and part of that trust is for them to be able to say things to me that I necessarily didn't want to hear, and it wouldn't offend me. I actually would, really take it with great appreciation. And one of the first homework assignments that I received was write a 2-page bio about yourself. And this came out of the fact that, I always felt like I had to be at the top of my game policy-wise. I like, really being analytical. I like problem solving. And basically it was, chill out. You don't have to be like the smartest person in the room all the time, but you need to make a connection with people. And so and a 2-page bio about yourself that is not your resume. Okay, so we're all so tightly identified with our, our work in our school, and but really what came out, and this took me about almost 3 months to write, and it was essentially a bio that reflected upon my values, like how my values were shaped. Obviously, from my immigrant parents who sacrificed so much to put 6 kids through college, had a lot to do with how I really have great appreciation, and still am a big advocate for public education, because that was a complete game changer for me. I didn't speak English until I entered kindergarten, and to look and see where I am today because of the great teachers who really believed in me. I'm a great advocate for healthcare, for universal healthcare, because my parents didn't have any. My father died at the young age of 63 years old because he didn't have healthcare, and ran a family business. And so really a big advocate for that. And then I'm a huge believer about everything we do is centered around building community. My parents would not have been successful with their business without the support that they had from their community. And I always used to say, we didn't have to be accountable to our parents for good grades. We had to be accountable to the hundreds of customers that my parents had for good grades. And so, but it's just that community that everybody just felt like they were in it for everyone else too. So if anyone wasn't doing well in the community, it was a stain on the whole community. I think that value has actually disappeared, and I hope that it does return. And I think we each have something to do around that. So I would say do it, but do it in an informed way. But the most informed way is to know yourself best first. And just, what motivates you, what drives you, what are your values, where did they come from? And because what now I'm able to do from that homework assignment is to almost speak like that's my core and foundation, right? And knowing also that when you're in public life, that not everyone's going to agree with you. In fact, people can be actually very vicious and attack you, but you know that you've got that core. And as long as you can project that and people know your sincerity and authenticity around that, people really appreciate that, particularly now in politics. So do it, but really get to know yourself well first.
Thank you, Controller Yee. I think that's a great note to end on. And like I said earlier, it really was an honor to have you here with us today.
It was a pleasure to meet both of you, and I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much.